This is Sawyer Robertson, and you're listening to the Bearcast on SicEm365.com.
Welcome into the Bearcast on SicEm365.com. I'm here today with Levi Caraway, and we are going to talk Baylor baseball. Levi, it was a disappointing ending to what was, a really fun start to the season. And I know we're going to kind of dive into the ebbs and flows here, but in general, just kind of take me through the season ending against Oklahoma State in the first round of the Big 12 tournament, just kind of your initial kind of thoughts immediately after that game.
Yeah, that game kind of felt like a microcosm of the season in the sense that they had the lead, they were kind of in control of that game, and then it just disappears toward the end with the two errors, the missed call by the umpire, just the horrible situational hitting that was kind of a theme throughout the entire season. And then, and kind of in the immediate aftermath, it just kind of was like the whole last month and a half of the season just kind of felt like what if this had happened? What if that had happened? And really, this team, as crazy as it sounds, they were 3 or 4 wins away from making the NCAA tournament. And this roster, I put the poll up this morning, or the survey results on the website this morning, and like pretty much 70% of the people said this was an NCAA tournament roster. I would agree with that. So I think it was definitely a disappointing end of the year that they ultimately didn't reach their season's goal. And the tough thing, too, is with all the seniors in the lineup, all the seniors on the roster, this was kind of the year to make it happen for the first time to make the NCAA tournament in Mitch Thompson's tenure. And it just didn't really happen, and it didn't come about. And so that's definitely disappointing. But then on the other side of that, it is a positive that they won 11 more games than they did last year. But you kind of have to take the good with the bad, and there's pros and cons to both sides.
There definitely is. And just kind of running through the numbers, they finished 33-22, 13-17 in the Big 12. That's just a 3-game improvement in Big 12 play from a year ago, in which they went 10-20. RPI settles at 76, which is actually kind of far away from being a tournament team. And then strength of schedule sits at 93. I think the biggest thing for me when I look at this, they were 17-19 versus top 100 opponents, and then 16-3 versus opponents ranked outside the top 100, 11-1 in midweek games, which is great. But in general, they kind of just beat the teams that, in some regards, they beat the teams they were for sure supposed to beat, and then they just didn't really come up with big series wins outside of the Arizona one. Outside of that, was pretty much just kind of 500 baseball and even less than that. Yeah,
and they did a really good job taking care of business in the games they should win, because that really hasn't been the case in the last couple of years. And so they go 20-4 in non-con. Like, that's definitely a step in the right direction, regardless of whether it's the toughest or not. And also it hurt too, because typically like the Texas midweek teams that you play were quite a few of the programs were having kind of really bad years. But regardless, toward the beginning of the season, they were just finding ways to win games in different ways. And then when Big 12 play started, they won that Sunday game against KU, and Kansas has had a really good year, finished toward top of the Big 12, and then lost kind of a disappointing series to K-State at home, and then went on the road and beat Arizona, who was a top 25 opponent. And that was the one weekend, I think, all season where they were the closest to what their ceiling could be. They played 26 out of 27 really good innings, and that one bad inning was a 10 spot in the first inning on Sunday. So they were so close to actually getting a sweep that weekend, which is crazy to say. And up until that point, like I said, they were playing really well, and they were winning games in different ways. And then that next weekend, they came home, and they lost a brutal game to Houston on Friday, where they had a big lead in the last couple innings and blew that. And that was one of the only games all year where you can really point to, like, the bullpen blew that game, which really didn't happen that much this year. And there was kind of a couple of bad defensive plays in that as well. And after that Friday loss, it just felt like from that point on, they just never could get back to the level they were playing earlier in the year. And not necessarily, like, obviously the competition was different, but like even when they went toe-to-toe with Oregon State, they went toe-to-toe with Auburn, and like they really were just playing with like a confidence and a swagger. And then after that Houston game, it just never was the same. And you'd have kind of glimpses here and there of who this team could be, but they really just didn't play as well as they could have down the stretch. And ultimately, they lost a lot of home series to teams they should have beat. They won the game on Friday against Arizona State, and then lost the next two against Oklahoma State, a team they're not that far off from talent-wise. They lost 2 of 3 at home to them. The TCU series, they got beat on the road. And then obviously, ultimately, the Tech and the Houston series are the most disappointing ones. But yeah, they didn't take care of business in Big 12 play. And I think they had the talent to at least go 500 in Big 12 play and go 16-14, something like that. And it just didn't happen.
Real quick, Sawyer Robertson has something to remind you about.
Want the latest information about your favorite team? Try out Sigum 365 premium content the next 3 months for just $5 by clicking the link below.
And now back to the Bearcast. So I know that you can point to losing series to non-tournament teams in Texas Tech and Houston as kind of ones that, maybe kept them from actually competing to get into the NCAA tournament. But I actually think it's the 10 games against Kansas State, Oklahoma State, and Arizona State that really was this team's undoing. They went 3-7 against those 3 teams this year, and 9 of those games were at home.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree that was literally those 10 games probably defined Baylor's season as to whether they were going to be a postseason team or not?
Yeah, I think so. I think also too, I think the series losses against Houston and Tech really just kind of impacted them mentally, because I feel like they never kind of got back to where they were. And so I think that definitely played a part in losing those series against Arizona State and Oklahoma State. But even then, regardless, you lose those series to Houston and Tech, yes, that was a huge hit, but they still could have got back on the right track against ASU and OSU, and they just didn't. And they had great opportunities at home to do that. And then when you look at the Big 12 standings toward the end of the year, you obviously have kind of the top tier with TCU, Arizona, KU, West Virginia, and stuff like that. But when you look toward that middle tier with K-State and Arizona State and Cincinnati, there's no reason Baylor shouldn't be in that next group. I think Baylor, talent-wise, is closer to them than they are the Houstons and the Utahs and the BYUs of the world. But the standings don't indicate that. And so you are what your record says you are, but I think they left a lot on the table, particularly in those series that you were talking about.
So as far as the Big 12 goes, I was just curious to get your opinion on this. They got 3 teams ranked inside the top 25 according to D1 Baseball, and they're all at the bottom of the top 25 standings. They did get 8 teams in the postseason that are going to regionals. But in your estimation, is the Big 12 actually good, or is this a conference that is pretty mediocre and pretty average, in which Baylor kind of dropped the ball a little bit in a situation where maybe they could have finished inside the, top 6 or top 5 because it's just not that good of a conference, especially at the top and the bottom, honestly.
Yeah, we'll find out this weekend, I guess, when they start going toe-to-toe with all the SEC teams and stuff. But I definitely think Baylor could have finished better. I don't think the Big 12 was just this absolute juggernaut. I don't think Baylor was just there's this huge gap between TCU and Baylor, between Arizona and I don't really see that. And I think that lends me to believe that they could have finished toward the middle of the conference, which wasn't, it's a solid conference, but it's not the ACC. It's not the SEC. It's stuff like that. So I think there was definitely more room for them to be better than they were and take advantage of some games. And they just didn't.
It was interesting because Oklahoma State and TCU were just so bad in the non-conference. Texas Tech was as well, and Tech never rebounded. But those other 2 programs were able to rebound despite playing the tough non-conference and their record not looking as good. I think that also probably hurt the perception of the Big 12 quite a bit when your best team struggles and then they end up being the top team in the conference.
Yeah.
Definitely doesn't help. Okay, so looking at a few other things. You mentioned the survey that you put out this week. 71% said this was a disappointment, and 15% said it was a failure. In your estimation, where do you stand on kind of how this season played out for the Bears?
Yeah, I think it's complicated because I think like I said in that article, the casual narrative will be oh, they won 30 plus games. That's a huge step in the right direction from last year. And yes, that is true. But with the senior heavy roster that they had, particularly with the lineup, I don't think they reached their they didn't reach obviously their goal of making the NCAA tournament, but I don't think they really lived up to what they were capable of doing. So I definitely consider that a disappointment, because as we move into these next few questions about the offseason and stuff, it's this was the year where they kind of had to strike while the iron's hot, because you had the senior heavy lineup, you had a new pitching coach who did a great job. and it didn't work out. And so next year it's going to be tough to kind of, yes, like this year was a building block in the grand scheme of things, but like you're going to lose most of your key contributors. So it's tough to say. I don't know if it's a failure, but it's definitely a disappointment in my opinion.
I've been reading a lot of your articles, and of course, the pitching coach Sean Snedeker coming in, he did an awesome job.
Yeah.
And he really kind of put together a rotation that competed, and for the most part, allowed Baylor to actually win games and be competitive in series after being just. I mean, you can probably speak to it, but I'm pretty sure they had the worst or one of the worst pitching staffs in the Big 12 the year before. What did you see from that group, and what do they have kind of to look forward to next year with this pitching staff in year number 2 with Snedeker?
Yeah, so last year I want to say they had the 5th worst ERA in the Power 4, and they were literally like the worst in the Big 12 in nearly every single category. And so when Coach Ned came in, and one of the biggest issues was they would just walk people, hand out hundreds of free passes. And so I think his biggest emphasis was just throw strikes, be confident in your stuff. And they went from literally the bottom in everything to the top half of the conference in one offseason. And so that's pretty exciting because they really only had one player who doesn't have extra eligibility, which is Gabe Craig, who had a borderline All-American season. And that's just a credit to Coach Sned because Gabe had never really had a successful season at Baylor in his 2 years prior. And then this season, he's just absolutely lights out. And you can go down the list with a lot of guys who really weren't proven players, and Coach Sned turned them into productive and above average players on Baylor's roster. And so I think the positive thing with that group is pretty much everybody who made an impact this year is going to be coming back next year. You'll have Mason Green coming back, Ethan Calder. I would still hope for them that they add probably another weekend starter or two, because I think that was a problem this year is when Mason Green got hurt and Bryson Bales didn't live up to expectations. They struggled to field like a competent starting rotation for those first few weeks of conference play. But toward the end of the year, I think they really found a groove. They had an excellent bullpen, which is pretty rare to say at this level, like that you can really, really trust your bullpen. And they did about as good of a job as you could have done. And like you were saying, I mean, there was very few games where pitching put them out of it, especially over the last month and a half of the season. They were pretty much in every single game because of the pitching.
But then on the flip side, the area that just absolutely killed them was this, batting lineup and the hitting in general. I know you posted a stat. They were 78 for 360 with runners on, and 52 for 243 with runners in scoring position since April 4th. I mean, just could not take advantage of opportunities, could not get the timely hits. What do you chalk that up to? Is that a coaching thing? Is that guys just weren't performing at the level that they needed to? Was it the rotation just not living up to expectations, a development problem? Where do you kind of stand on that?
Yeah, it's tough to, when you hear that number out loud, it's tough to even fathom that that's possible, especially when you have a lineup when 6 of the starters on an everyday basis are seniors. And I think it's tough to pinpoint exactly what it is, whether it was pressing, whether it was coaching. I don't know, but a lot of it comes down to the 4 or 5 guys they really counted on to be like the dudes this year all kind of regressed from last year. Like there are 3 senior outfielders, Enzo Apodaca, Wesley Jordan, and Ty Johnson. And Enzo and Wes both had solid seasons, but they didn't take that next step that you kind of had hoped they would in their senior seasons. Ty Johnson really struggled this year offensively. Hunter Simmons had a really good year up until the last month of the season where he really struggled, but he just didn't have the pop that you would have probably liked post injury, which is obviously understandable with what he came back from with his broken leg and stuff. And then the coaching staff was extremely high on Jack Little at first base, and he had a really tough year and was on pace to break the program record in strikeouts before he kind of got benched over the last month or so of the season. But those are your 5 guys that they really counted on to kind of be the top 5 guys in the lineup. And then ultimately the best players were your 9-hole Tyreek Kemp, who ended up being the team MVP, Travis Sanders, who didn't even start until mid-March on a daily basis, and then a true freshman in Pearson Reebok. So it's kind of crazy that the 3 players that you expected kind of to be role players in a sense ended up being your dudes. And then Cortland Castle had a good season at catcher, but I mean, he was not going to be the guy to carry the offense or anything like that. And so I think just the fact that the guys who you expected to be your leaders all were disappointing is kind of what it ultimately comes down to. And then it's so tough to pinpoint like what exactly was the problem with runners in scoring position, runners on, and stuff like that. But those numbers are just so bad. And I think ultimately that kind of has to come back on coaching, whether it's fair or not.
And when you kind of look going forward off of that, you mentioned Pearson Reebok and Travis Sanders. I believe they both have eligibility and could return and be big parts of, what Baylor's trying to do next year. But outside of them, where does Baylor attack here? Like, how many guys do you think they need to bring in to start? Like starting caliber, starting competition for this lineup and the pitching staff as well. I know you kind of mentioned that you're kind of looking at maybe a few pitchers that can come in and provide a lot of depth and potentially a starter on the weekend. But for batting, what do you see there?
Yeah, I'll start with the pitching because that's a bit easier. I think they need to add probably just some depth, but I think they have a really solid group coming back if they're able to retain everybody, which I don't see why they wouldn't. And just for example, I mean, TCU's Friday night guy, all Big 12, he came from Wichita State. Oklahoma State's pitcher, first team all Big 12, came from Hawaii. These guys are out there. They just have to go find them. And with Sean Snedeker at the helm of the pitching staff, I feel fine about them. I think they'll be good in a good spot next year. But as for the lineup, that's where a lot of questions arise because you're going to have to be replacing 6 to 7 starters. And, well, yeah, I mean, maybe you have some good incoming true freshmen. You have some good redshirt freshmen back next year. I don't think you want to be in a position where you pencil any of those guys into the starting lineup. I think that's just a very dangerous it's a very risky game to play when you're counting on so many unknowns to be everyday starters. So I think they're going to have to make an impact in the portal, and we really haven't seen that throughout Mitch Thompson's tenure, that they go out and attack the portal and bring in 5+ guys. And it's not necessarily it's not for a lack of trying. I mean, we know that Baylor is not going to win these head-to-head battles against these SEC schools and stuff like that. But you have to find a way to go get some mid-major players, the guys like Travis Sanders who were really talented high school recruits but got hurt and were buried on the depth chart at Tech, and then they come here and they have a great year. I don't know what the formula is going to be, but you have to figure something out where you're bringing impact players in. Because as crazy as it sounds, I mean, we just talked about how bad the lineup was this year. They could be a lot worse if they don't get some proven bats. And then ideally, you would like to really add some pop in the lineup because it was kind of like a running joke. But with this lineup, it was the 3 true outcomes of single strikeout walk, which is not what it should be. If you're going to have a 3 true outcome hitter, you need to have pop in the lineup. And this lineup had very, very little. Very little pop, very little home run record. I mean, obviously, when you play at Baylor ballpark, your home run numbers aren't going to be the strongest, but you have to find guys that can deliver extra base hits consistently.
You and I talked a little bit about the House settlement that should be coming down at some point.
Yeah.
What's your kind of expectation on how that impacts Baylor going forward into next year and potentially the future as well?
Yeah, I think the House settlement, if it's enforced like the way it's supposed to, I think it'll help a lot because you're going to see most of these programs use most of their cap for basketball and football. So you're not going to have the SEC schools willing to pay $200K for a transfer in the future. Like that's just not going to probably happen. And so I think and also too, if roster limits are limited in the future, I think that's going to help kind of spread the talent out. Baylor will be able to get better players in, et cetera, et cetera. But currently the House settlement still hasn't passed, and it was supposed to any week now for the past couple of weeks. And so we're really approaching next Mondays when the transfer portal opens. So we're rapidly approaching that the House settlement doesn't get passed. And so what you're going to see probably, like what we did with basketball, was where the big schools with a lot of money to blow will just come in and will be like, oh, well, their cap is still not it's still not in place yet, where we're going to go spend all these money on these transfers. And so I think that's going to hurt Baylor in the sense that they're not going to be able to win those recruiting battles because you're going to have the SEC and the ACC schools just blowing money and throwing bags at players. So that's why you're going to really have to lean on to the gyms and the JUCO guys. You're going to have to find some way to make it work. And it's going to be really tough because it's not going to be an even playing field at the time we're recording this on Thursday.
Okay, so last question for you. I know there's going to be a lot of talk about Mitch Thompson being on the hot seat and what that may mean going into next year. I don't think we need to dive too deep into that, but I do think the important question is, what do you think Baylor needs to do next year for it to be a successful season? And then the second part is, how much confidence do you have in them actually being able to achieve that?
Mm-hmm. I think so much of that question kind of determines what they do this summer, because if you show me the roster they have on paper coming back, like I don't think that's a team that's going to be better than they were this year. But if they are able to add quite a few starting caliber position players, I think they could be pretty good. And also, baseball is tough because it's like this past season or this season, it's like they had all these seniors in the lineup, and so you would have expected they should be better than they were, and they weren't. So it's tough to say, but I think they really need to be at least a bubble team to kind of feel confident about this coaching staff and the direction of the program moving forward. But hopefully they make the NCAA tournament, but I don't really see how that's possible at the moment until they make some more impactful additions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Levi, for joining. We got to talk a little bit about the baseball program and where things are at. Hopefully things start trending in a little bit of a better direction, even more so next year, and they can build some momentum. We will see on all that. I know we'll talk more probably, Levi, in the offseason as they start adding players and start fixing the roster. But that's it for today. This has been the Bearcast on SicEm365.com.
Join SicEm 365 Premium on a $1 for 1 month trial to read our experts' notes and insights. Know about high school commits, off-season transfers, coaching staff changes, and so much more before the rest. Also, download the SicEm 365 app on your iPhone today to get instant notifications of breaking news, read up on the latest inside info, easily interact with other Baylor fans on our forums, and get alerts for anything published by your favorite staff members.